Hello, High Rock. I'm so glad I get to be with you today as we continue our journey through the 23rd Psalm. I want to say a special hello to our Lexington folks. I know that today is a special day with a mix of hope and grieving as your final service in Lexington before you join the Arlington congregation as we hopefully move into the new building for our first service together. I hope that some of today's message and perhaps some of my own story of closing a church before arriving at High Rock will connect with you today. And now, to everyone, I'm guessing that you may be growing a little tired of being compared to sheep. And I get it. Being a sheep, or worse, sheeple, is far from a compliment. And if you feel that way, I have good news for you because Psalm 23 takes a little turn in today's verse. There's a frame shift to a different metaphor. We started off with the Lord as our shepherd, but today, the Lord is depicted as our host, and we are the Lord's honored guests. The Lord prepares a banquet for us and fills our cups to overflowing. It's time to celebrate. You can keep your verse 2, green pastures and still waters. We'll take the verse 5 party, am I right? Well, pump your brakes. Sure, there's a table filled with food and cups filled with drink, but there's that line in the middle. Where exactly is this party taking place? In the presence of my enemies? What kind of party is this? Suddenly, I'm not sure if I should check yes on the RSVP. We're in a sermon series on Psalm 23 called Fearless Flock, and last week, Pastor Dave talked about dangerous places, dangerous circumstances, the darkest valley, the valley of the shadow of death. This week, we move on from dangerous circumstances to dangerous people. Truthfully, the two often go hand in hand. When I go hiking, especially on multi-day hikes, people often ask me, "Aren't you afraid of wild animals? What about bears?" And to be clear, you do need to be concerned about bears. But really, the most dangerous animal on the trail is you. It's other people. And there are a lot more of them sitting right next to you than there are on the trail. And just like with bears, you may be tempted to keep your distance. I'm not just being facetious. People are dangerous. If you take a moment to recall your greatest hurts, your greatest pains, the deepest trauma you carry, chances are pretty high that those wounds came from other people. And the deepest wounds likely came from some of the people who are closest of all. This party is definitely sounding a lot less appealing. I mean, what is going on here? Psalm 23 is a song of David. The Psalms are like the top 150 God-approved worship hit songs, and David has more number one hits than anyone. But he's not just trying to get to the top of God's Billboard rankings. These songs are part of his story. They are the fullest expression of his greatest joys and his deepest pains. It's no different with this song, Psalm 23. And this line, "You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies," probably points to a singular moment in David's life. It was a moment when his greatest enemy was one of the people who was closest to him, his own blood. When I was a little kid growing up in New Jersey, I didn't know any Asians outside of my family. Whenever I go back to New Jersey now, it feels like it's filled with Asians, but not back then. And I was constantly tormented for being Asian. Half Korean, if you're wondering. Some of you have heard me share stories about childhood bullies like Mark or Harry. Well, this time I'm thinking about Chuck, the third in my unholy trinity. I remember one day in particular. A lot of the details are fuzzy. I don't even remember what aspect of my appearance that Chuck decided to critique that day, but I do remember this. As he tormented me, he demanded that everyone come over to him, leaving me to stand alone. A genius move. This kid could teach a master class on bullying. And everyone did what Chuck suggested. Everyone left me, except my brother. I stood there all alone, except for Eugene. Then Chuck said, "Eugene, come over here with us. Be on our side." And he did. He walked over to Chuck, my own brother. Nothing that Chuck could say or do would ever be able to hit me that hard. Now, that was a long time ago, and nothing I've experienced could compare to what King David went through. But it's usually not helpful to compare our pains with one another. David's pain was real, but so is mine, and so is yours. So before we get to David's story, I want you to think about your story. Who are some of the people who have hurt you, caused you to live in fear, people who have bullied you, tormented you, gaslit you? Maybe it was long ago, or maybe it's your present reality. Maybe it's a boss or a coworker or a neighbor, or maybe even someone much, much closer. And I'm asking you to do this not to dredge up and awaken old grievances. Instead, it's an invitation for us to consider how the Lord can be not only our shepherd who leads us through dark places, but also our host who can set a feast before us even in the presence of our enemies. What could have prompted King David to write such a line? You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. And it's more than that. He also says, you anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Having your cup filled to overflowing is exactly what it sounds like. But having your head anointed with oil probably doesn't sound appealing to most of us. We spend good money on products that pull the oil off our heads rather than adding even more. I think it's helpful to think of this anointing oil as like a top-end self-care product like oil of Olay or even better, La Mer. Whatever the marketing might say, those products are largely oil and fragrance, which is exactly what David is writing about. In the ancient world, generous banquet hosts would provide their guests with lavish, fragrant oils for anointing. In the harsh desert air, those oils were protective and restorative and a mark of dignity and delight. They would make your face shine and fill the room with pleasant aroma. One ancient text notes how the king would lavish the choicest oils upon the foreheads of his guests. It's that extra touch that makes the meal so much more than food. It's an experience. It's an honor. That's the kind of host the Lord is. Generously filling your table with food, your cup with the finest drink, with an added touch of personal care for your health and joy. Such a treat would be a delight even in the best of times. But can you imagine experiencing such incredible hospitality while being pursued by your worst enemies? David had experienced this kind of rescue and restoration many times, in a figurative sense, like in his younger years when he was unjustly pursued by a murderous King Saul. But as I was poring over David's life, I discovered that there was a singular, literal instance of this kind of hospitality in David's later years. We read about this moment in 2 Samuel chapter 17. When David came to Mahanaim, Shobi son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Machir son of Amiel from Lodebar, and Barzillai the Gileadite from Rogelim, brought beds, basins, and earthen vessels, wheat, barley, meal, parched grain, beans and lentils, honey and curds, sheep and cheese from the herd, for David and the people with him to eat. For they said, the troops are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. There are a lot of details here that we could unpack, but let me just highlight a few. The men who are mentioned are all leaders of conquered peoples. David is now being pursued and he has relatively few men with him, and they're all exhausted from battle and fleeing from a much larger enemy. David is in a weakened and desperate state. This could be their chance. Here is David, their former conqueror, now at their mercy. Strike while the iron is hot, right? But that's not what they did. I don't know if it's because David had treated them fairly or if it's just that God was with David. Instead of hitting David while he's down, they welcome him and his men as honored guests, serving him the feast of their best foods. David was literally feasting in the presence of his enemies. Surely he must have thought that the Lord was providing this grace and protection. It's a great story, and we can't unpack it all here, but there are spies and narrow escapes, double agents. It is an epic story. But it's also a tragedy because the enemy that's pursuing David is someone very close to him. The man commanding the armies that seek to kill David is his very own son, Absalom. This must have seemed like the lowest moment of his life. The disgrace, the danger, being at the mercy of former enemies and pursued by his present enemy, his own son. It must have seemed hopeless. But this banquet sits at the center of the turnaround in this story. This is the moment when David starts to see that everything is going to be okay. The Lord has prepared a table in the presence of his enemies. If the Lord can do that, then anything is possible. I imagine that it was this experience that inspired King David as he wrote this verse of his most famous song, Psalm 23. With an experience like that, he could imagine that no matter what enemy he might face, he could celebrate that the Lord is the one who is in control of his fate, not his enemies. Even in the presence of those enemies, even if it's the incomprehensible pain of being at war with your own son, even then, the Lord can restore and refresh you in ways you never expected. So turn to and trust in the Lord. Now, that doesn't mean it would be easy for David. Not at all. Before the story of that feast was over, David's heart would be broken. But God would mend him and lift him up again. Some of David's most uplifting songs were written in times of virtual despair, and I believe that Psalm 23 is one of them. I think that's why so many of us turn to Psalm 23 when we're faced with the most difficult, trying, and heartbreaking circumstances in our life. We need to celebrate that the Lord is our shepherd and that he deeply cares for us despite our stubborn, short-sighted, anxiety-driven natures. And as we see in verse 5, the Lord is also our host who prepares a table for us, even in the presence of our enemies. When we cling to the mercy of God, God heals us, restores us, and celebrates us with honor and generosity. I'm getting a little older now, perhaps like King David in his more advanced part of his life. And one of the features of my age is that I keep telling the same stories. If you've been around High Rock for a while, you've already heard most of my stories. But one of the wonderful things about a place like this is that there are always new people entering our community, and all of my old stories are new to them. I came to High Rock in February of 2012, and it was like the Lord had set a table for me in the presence of my enemies. Like David in 2 Samuel, it was a turning point in my story. In 2006, my wife Amy was diagnosed with a mutation that leads to cancer, the same stomach and breast cancer that took the life of her mother when Amy was only 7 years old. Later that same year, we received confirmation that our youngest daughter's developmental delays were definitely signs of autism. Amy's diagnosis led to the total removal of her stomach and later on a double mastectomy. I stopped counting her surgeries when we got past 12. Our 2-year-old daughter's diagnosis led to expensive treatments and all kinds of trials and eventually placement into a full-time residence, largely for her own safety. We just couldn't manage all the challenges. For 10 years, it was a challenge to even get a full night of sleep. These challenges and others made our lives unmanageable and took a toll on our 2 older children. Meanwhile, I was a solo pastor at another church, and then I found my brother Eugene passed away in his apartment. The same one who abandoned me to stand at my bully's side, that brother had become my greatest friend and support. He was a lifeline during that terrible period, and I had to say goodbye to him that Christmas when I needed him most. It was too much to handle. I was depressed. My marriage was tanking. I got help. I took medication. Despite it all, I couldn't handle my family and my job, and my church let me go. I had helped build and shepherd that community for 13 years. It was hard not to feel like they were my enemies. It was hard, but I believed that it was the right thing to do for them and for me. Have you ever experienced something like that? When the right thing, the best thing, still feels like an attack? Finally, when our church elders decided that it was time to close our church doors, we had a celebration. We shared stories and tears and praised God for all the ways that we had been blessed. At that point, I was looking for a job outside of ministry. I wasn't finished with God, but I felt like God was finished with me. But at that celebration, Art and Pam Kinzinger came up to me. Pam was one of the founding members of our old church, but after she and Art married, they started attending High Rock, where they were both involved in leadership. They approached me and said, High Rock has been looking for a pastor for young adults, and we haven't found anyone. Would you be interested in having us throw your name into the hat? A few months and many conversations later, and I started at High Rock. And it really was a feast. I went from being a solo pastor to being on a team of many. I went from feeling isolated to being surrounded and supported by so many people full of life and faith. I went from a world where I felt like no one could understand the struggles that I had in my family to a team that was led by Dave Swaim. And if there was anyone who had a more challenging family than mine, his was definitely it. And it has been like that feast described in Psalm 23. Enemies and challenges surround me, but the Lord has set a table for me and anointed me and filled my cup to overflowing. I couldn't do it. No matter how hard I had tried, I couldn't create that kind of blessedness. But God could and did. Normally, I like to wrap things up by suggesting several applications of what we learn from the Bible. Today is a little bit different. Rather than applications, I want to offer a few encouragements from King David's life and from mine. First, Psalm 23 is a great reminder that trusting in God, following the Lord's path, ultimately leads to good places, even if it passes through the darkest valley, like Dave talked about last week. Sometimes we think that the blessings we desire will arrive when all the obstacles and enemies are overcome and all the potential threats are removed. Sector secure. But King David's words and life remind us that God can provide for us even in the midst of our worst challenges. It's not something you can create or force. Instead, it's when we're holding on to God in trust, or maybe even in desperation, that God leads us to a place we never imagined possible. So don't give up. Don't lose heart. Lean on each other. But keep trusting in God, and I believe you'll be surprised at how God provides along the way. It's like when I was hiking on the Appalachian Trail last summer, and my friend Viking and I came to a crossroad where there was a whole group of people waiting. Hikers like to call them trail angels, people who find joy in providing hospitality to weary hikers. They literally had set a table for us. We arrived at the tail end of breakfast, so we had a late breakfast of eggs, bacon, and pancakes, and then an early lunch of freshly grilled burgers. And they let us drop off all our garbage so we didn't have to carry it. And then they had greeting cards on the table so we could write home, and they would mail them for us. It was like a living parable of the importance to keep following the path, but to be ready to be surprised by the blessings of the road. Psalm 23 is a great way to keep that frame of mind. My second encouragement is this: people matter. Sometimes they're the only things that matter. You might be tempted to hurt the people who have hurt you. You might feel the desire to put people in their place or maybe leave them behind and burn the bridges behind you. And no doubt, sometimes it is the right thing to walk away from a toxic relationship. But walking away doesn't mean leaving a path of scorched earth behind you. As the Apostle Paul wrote in his letter to the believers in Rome, if it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. My brother Eugene, the one who had abandoned me for Chuck the bully, that same brother had become a primary support at a critical time in my life. And before that, I had wounded him in so many ways, deeper than anything he'd done to me. But when I became a believer, I was overwhelmed by the importance of forgiveness and all its possibilities. It's not easy. Forgiveness has presented me with some of the most difficult challenges in life. But aren't all the most valuable things in life challenging? It was heartbreaking to lose him that Christmas, but would have been so much harder to have lost him without ever experiencing the love and friendship that forgiveness made possible. One final story that I hope will tie all this together. Back when my wife was having all her stomach surgeries, her second stay at Mass General started with a trip to the emergency room. That emergency surgery ended up damaging a nerve that left her right leg completely paralyzed. The medical team told us it might be temporary, but it might also be permanent. All we could do was wait and see. And if that wasn't trying enough, Amy developed pancreatitis. Yeah, we didn't know what that was either. But in addition to the pain, it meant that she couldn't eat or drink and had to be fed through a PICC line. So there she was in the hospital, dropping to under 100 pounds, unable to eat or drink, unable to walk. Was she happy? Absolutely not. She told me that she felt imprisoned, confined, useless, and resentful. Maybe a little of that resentment was directed at God. It was during times like this that Psalm 23 became a constant mantra for her. She memorized it and said it over and over. Every time she started to feel afraid or hopeless or numb inside, she would repeat the words of Psalm 23 so she could hold on to hope. And after being in the hospital for a while, Amy realized that she was seeing the same nurses and janitors and doctors and interns and book cart volunteers, patients and transporters all day, day after day. And remember, people matter. So reluctantly at first, she started to reach out and make some connections. As days became weeks, she started to make friends with Elmo and Mike and Joyce and people like Lois who helped her with her daily sponge bath. As Amy began to focus on them rather than just all of her pains, conversations began to turn spiritual, and all these people began to open up to her about their deepest questions and struggles. At first, Amy had been miserable. But by valuing these people with her time and attention, she found herself starting to genuinely enjoy a renewed sense of purpose. She started to actually thank God for her time in that hospital bed. One day it was finally time to get her feeding line removed. Hooray! But it was an unfamiliar face. Instead of the regular nurses, one of the nursing managers came by because they were shorthanded. She seemed quiet, but troubled. So Amy started asking friendly questions about her work at the hospital. The woman noticed the cross around Amy's neck, and Amy told her that she loved and followed Jesus. So the manager said, "Really?" And then the floodgates opened. She confided, I've been asking God for guidance as I hate my job. I feel mistreated as a supervisor, and sometimes I just miss being a regular nurse." It was like an impromptu session of spiritual direction. Amy was able to encourage her to find strength and guidance from God. That maybe even if she couldn't find happiness in her struggles, she might at least find meaning and purpose, just like Amy had in her hospital bed. By the end of that conversation, the woman thanked Amy profusely for being such a godsend. They hugged and prayed together before the woman left. From one perspective, Amy had nothing to give. But returning to the words of Psalm 23 over and over, she found her thoughts and trust redirected to God. She was tempted to feel like she had nothing, but God was setting a table for her and giving her the dignity of an honored guest, even in the presence of her enemies of sickness, medical errors, and partial paralysis. Friends, let's close by also reciting the words of Psalm 23. Verse 1 through verse 5 together. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Amen.